As planners, we need to be able to think about the future and relate what that future looks like to the plans we need to have in place in order to achieve whatever goals and objectives are desired by the location we serve. In this module, we'll talk about 2 ways planners forecast to ensure infrastructure meets society's needs well into the future. The 2 methods are travel demand forecasting and demography. Transportation planners use something called travel demand modeling to determine where to build the newest infrastructure, what modes to plan for, and how many people will use those modes. But what is travel demand modeling, or TDM? To many, TDM is a black box. It's a series of algorithms or a bunch of math that's stuffed into a computer and spits out a number. In fact, it's been satirized so often as being something that only specialists know how to use that we often have memes and jokes about how all our roads are built because we are simply following the instructions of a computer model. But modeling doesn't have to be quite that big a black box. We can peer behind the curtain to determine how these models will operate, and having better knowledge about the operation of these models will help us better understand why the outputs are what they are and how to get better results from such models. It'll also be useful in your future career, whether you're into transportation modeling or follow some other path, because models and data and analysis are swiftly becoming the status quo for planning in many sectors. So what exactly is a model? At its core, a travel demand model is really just a series of mathematical equations that we use to represent how people will make choices, when people might travel, and how the transportation system, whether it's a highway system or rail system, will impact people's travel behavior. We use a series of fairly simple equations to predict the usage of future transportation systems. That is, what happens if the population expands or employment expands? How will congestion on our roads be impacted? How will the use of public transportation change? We can look at different configurations of population and employment and see how that will impact the transportation system. Say more people move out to the suburbs. How will our highway system manage such a change in the location of people? This is something that happened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, a dramatic shift from employment and population within the CBD out to the suburbs, as we've discussed before. And had models been more used in Auckland, we could have reconfigured our highway system to better handle the changes in movement from suburb to CBD and back out again to fulfill employment needs. We can also use travel demand models when different infrastructure investments are being considered. We might have a smaller pot of money in which we can invest in highways or transit or bikeways, and so we wanted to determine which one of these investments will reduce congestion or result in some desired outcome through that investment. And we can also use travel demand models to test different policies. That is, what happens if we have high or low parking rates in the CBD? Will that move people away from the car into public transportation? What if we have just the bare minimum for public transportation, invest more money in highways, or flip that around and have more intensive transportation service with fewer highway investments? How will that change overall traffic flow in our city? All of these things are possible with a travel demand model. First, let's look to the past to understand how these models were first developed. They first came about in the 1950s as computing power started to take off. In the 1950s, the simplest computer could occupy an entire room and often was a series of vacuum-style tubes which used pneumatic processes to read punch cards and output simple results. Using even this rudimentary computer, more complex tasks could be completed than could be done by hand. So planners started to develop models in which we could hypothesize about the outcome of certain investments, and we could run these multiple times with small differences to see how those small changes would impact traffic in our cities. They were used for the early highway system, And we looked at ways in which modified transit or modified land uses or even air quality would shift as a result of these transportation investments. The current structure that we use today in travel demand modeling emerged in the 1960s. There were some improvements over the last 30 years, but a lot of those improvements were based in academia and haven't quite made it even today to practice. Even in Auckland, only a couple of years ago have we moved from a fairly rudimentary 1960s style 4-step model to a more complex model called a dynamic travel assignment model. We'll talk more about that much later. The gist is, what we talk about for the next few weeks is still applicable in practice today. So why should we care about travel demand modeling? Well, it enables a number of things. It enables us to compare a lot of different policies and plans to determine what the outcome of these different investments might be. So we may look at this in terms of systems planning. That is, how do we better integrate the highway system into our public transportation system? What's the outcome if we build more public transportation in our cities? The modeling process and the outputs from those models are often required by legislation, that is, in conducting corridor studies or even long-range transportation plans. It's also used often in environmental analysis, the RMA process, where we have large development or highly impactful public transportation systems or highway systems that may have a big impact on air quality or the environment in general. And so a travel demand model can help determine what the change in pollutants and change in environmental quality or air quality will be over time as a result of these considered investments. So how do we in a single model represent the entire existing transportation system, the land uses that surround that transportation system, the people that use that transportation system, and the way people interact with all of those mechanisms? Well, travel simulations require that the urban area first be represented by a series of much smaller geographic areas. These can take on a number of names depending on the jurisdiction that's working on the model or developing the model, but often these are called travel analysis zones or traffic analysis zones, or TAZs. That's the most common nomenclature for special zones which represent geographic areas of population and the transportation system as well as the land use system. The zones are often characterized by population and employment and some other factors that may influence trip taking, like household income, number of cars owned, the type of uses within a specific zone, etc. Zones are both the location of trip origins, or where trips are produced, so they're trip producers, and the location of destinations, or what we call trip attractors. So every trip that's modeled starts in a TAZ and ends in a TAZ. Some of those trips start in the same TAZ and end in the same TAZ, but more often than not, they travel between TAZs. Trip making is then estimated based on the household level, or aggregated. And this is kind of the historic and in many ways the current approach, though many models, like I mentioned before, such as dynamic traffic assignment models, will look at the individual level. But for most models, the level of estimation is based at the household level. Each household is grouped together based on their similar characteristics, then aggregated at the zone level. Trip making is then assumed to begin at the center of the zone, what we call the zone centroid. We'll look at that in a second. So trips that are really short, as I mentioned just a second ago, that begin in a single zone and end in a single zone, which we call an intrazonal trip, are often not directly included in forecasts. One of the problems with this traditional approach, then, is that those short walking trips and bike trips are often left out of the model process altogether. And so, historically, using travel demand modeling, we've underdeveloped the infrastructure for biking and walking. And as a result, we've focused too much of our attention on vehicle travel and, to some degree, public transportation. Moving away from just the zones, we then represent the highway system and the transit system as networks for our computer-based analysis. Networks are represented by a few components. First, there are links, which represent the highway segments or transit lines, and then there are nodes, which represent intersections and other points in the network. Nodes are the locations where two links meet each other. there are typically no nodes without links connecting to those nodes. Each link has a series of data connected with it. So the data for links often includes travel times on that link, the average speed of vehicles crossing that link or the speed limit required when crossing that link, and the capacity and direction. So general information you would find about any road. Node data will include information about intersections and often the location of the node or coordinates of the node. And so nodes become our spatial points, our location across the city of intersections, and then the links are easily just joined between those nodes. So let's just take a sample city with a few zones. Inside our circle here is a simple network of a few links and a few zones nested in there. So first we have that TAZ, that traffic analysis or transportation analysis zone. And here it's in gray and it's bounded by a series of links. An important thing to note when we're examining the layout of TAZs, you'll note that they do not bisect or cross generally major roads. They are within those major roads. This makes it easier to model trips that are going to and from a zone along that infrastructure. So within that small area, we'll have a number of components. First, the black lines represent the links. So those are our roads, our highways, even our transit rail lines. Next, along those links, or at intersections of those links, we have our nodes. And then in the center of our TAZ, we have our centroid. That is the geographic center of the TAZ. And again, that's the location at which we model all trips attracted to and produced by a zone. The center of the TAZ is not always the geographic centroid either. It can also be the spatially weighted center. That is, if all of the population of this TAZ happen to be at the very bottom or the south side of the TAZ, we may move that centroid closer to the south side to better represent the average travel time leaving that zone. We'll have plenty of time to talk about this in the coming weeks if it seems a little bit confusing right now. Then we need our ingress and egress points, and that is, how do we get from that centroid to the road network itself? And so we just have a series of centroid connectors, which are imaginary lines which represent the average travel time to get from the center of our zone to those roads. That sums it up for the general infrastructure of a travel demand model. In the next module, we'll get deeper into the process by which we develop the travel demand model, examine its outputs, and then put in alternatives and compare those against the other options. How do you predict what's to come? How do you make clear plans when the likelihood of any future is so unclear? Maybe it's a fool's errand, the mad science of extrapolating events and trends from past decades into the future. Perhaps the future holds too many unknowns to be predictable. Maybe there's just too many black swans.
What's a black swan? Before the discovery of Australia, we had no reasons to believe that swans could be of any other color but white, or people in the old world. And effectively, there was an expression in medieval England. You'd sooner see a black swan than, say, for example, it was like saying when pigs fly, or when I don't know, when George Bush does something intelligent or something. There was immediately exception. So there was an expression until we saw Australia, and effectively the sighting of a single bird destroyed millennia of confirmation. So it was posed as a logical problem by showing that there's no reason. You cannot rule out a black swan because you haven't seen any. Okay, so my problem is not a logical question. My black swan is an event. It's not a bird. And it's an event that has three properties. The first property, it is hard to predict. Very difficult to predict based on information. Am I standing in the right spot? Okay. Based on information before its occurrence, prior information, based on historical information. You have here a sample of black swans. The most interesting one is the tie. Someone's going to forecast the future. We have to forecast that human beings, 2,000 years away would constrict their blood supply with this device, for example, okay, and attend meetings, okay? So that's very difficult to predict. The computer was a black swan. It changed the world, and nobody thought the computer could do anything. You know, it was initially used for combinatorics. I mean, the Watson from IBM did not think that this tool could have any use. The rise of religions, black swans, totally unpredictable. Harry Potter is a black swan. A lot of cultural phenomena are black swans. To me, the most significant black swan, and the one I'm going to focus next, a few minutes, is the First War. The First War we had after Napoleon, we thought for about 100 years that the world became civilized and that, you know, people became conscious of the need for peace. And you had this devastating war, the biggest war, something that destroyed, and of course it came in 2 volumes. You had volume 1 and then you had a sequel. So here we have black swans, events of low predictability, high consequence. But the most vicious part is the following one, is that before the fact, they're extremely predictable, but after the fact, you know what? We saw them coming. So we have, this is what I call the retrospective distortion. Is these events are prospectively unpredictable, retrospectively predictable. Why? We even have disciplines to give us the illusion of understanding the world, you see. We have disciplines that make us misunderstand the world by giving us this illusion of predictability. History, for example, economics, other such things.
Demography is one of those sciences. It's the science of population. More specifically, it's the statistical study of human population. It focuses not just on counting the number of people in a given region or the population subset, but also the locations in space these people and groups inhabit. It dives deeply into better understanding the composition or structure of the population. In ascertaining detailed information about the population, it also seeks to better forecast the growth and decline of population, the many components of change, for example births, involved in the ever-evolving growth pattern, and the economic characteristics that drive population change, including economic activity, employment status, occupation and industry, income, wealth, or poverty. It doesn't stop there, though. Demographers are also concerned with the many demographic variables that together span the diversity of our cultures, from age to ethnicity to educational attainment. Those involved in the science of demography use qualitative analysis to describe a population, or they may describe socioeconomic status by summative measures using income, education, and occupation variables. And then we get to the most complex task of all, the one in which all those black swans tend to pop up. The population projections and estimates constitute a core focus of demographic techniques. Demographers use a wide variety of techniques to construct population projections or provide a set of scenarios that encompass a range of potential population forecasts. In some cases, demographers are also tasked with estimating domestic migration, creating labor force projections, and making other estimations. Why do urban planners even care about demography? At the root of urban planning is people. The entire field of planning is concerned with people. While we talk a lot about the built environment and infrastructure, all of this is planned for people. Those plans can differ significantly based on the growth and change in different groups within the population. Attempting to project where and how many of these groups there will be in the future makes planning much better. This is true for physical infrastructure like transport, where having a sense of where people live and to some degree may travel in the future is quite important. But forecasting the composition in addition to the location of future populations is also critical for planning social infrastructure like community services, recreation, healthcare, etc. As we saw at the beginning of this lecture, black swans will always appear, so even our best projections can and often do get it wrong. A good example of this is the way in which many highways and fixed rail public transportation networks are designed. Most of these are designed in a radial pattern, focused on bringing people in from the suburbs to the CBD for work and back out for the return trip. Over time, but particularly starting in the 1950s and 60s, there was significant movement of people away from the CBD. As the jobs and the retail sector followed the people to the suburbs, demand for suburb-to-suburb movement increased. However, our networks were not designed for this type of travel pattern. As a result, we have significantly overbuilt inner-city highways, rapidly declining public transportation use, and massive congestion on roads now that crisscross the suburbs. We didn't see the black swan, the shift where people lived, where people worked, and where they shopped.